I'm Nell Gaither. First, just thanks to the Dallas Way for allowing me to speak again. This is the second time I've done this talk, and I really appreciate the honor of being invited back the second time. I wanted to start my story with a personal observation. It seems to me that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what being transgender, or being trans, as I like to say, is. When I mention that word, most people probably think about some sort of surgery, as if surgical intervention defines being trans. But the most fundamental aspect of medical intervention sought by trans persons is often simply hormone adjustment. Our healthcare also often encompasses mental health services, and although many folks think that that's related to personal issues of gender identity, it's more likely that the majority of counseling needs stem from the stress that accompanies the incredible stigma that society has for trans identities, not from being trans itself. For trans persons, their honest gender identity is a most precious and valued possession. The difficulty comes from outside forces that try to deny our effort to embrace our identity. This social stigma is an enormous weight. Around 40% of trans persons attempt suicide at some point in their life. To put that into perspective, only about 1.5% to 3% of the general population attempt suicide, and for persons who suffer from chronic depression, it's about 20%, so about half of what trans persons experience. This leads up to my story. My first encounter with the issue of suicide was at the Creating Change conference in 2010 down in Dallas, where I volunteered to help host the trans hospitality suite that we had there. We generally had about 10 to 15 trans and gender nonconforming persons there on any one night, chatting, playing games, or just relaxing after the activities of the day. One night was distinctly different. There was a big announcement that was going to be made, and the rumor was that it had something to do with the status of the Federal Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or ENDA. For a little background on this, 3 years earlier, in 2007, there had been a prior version of ENDA before Congress, and during negotiations, protections covering gender identity, which would cover trans persons, and gender identity and expression were dropped. When that news came out, the trans community was disappointed, to say the least. Because of some earlier promises that gender identity would remain, it felt more like betrayal. ENDA was reintroduced in 2009, so not long before this conference, and the trans community was looking for news about whether we would be included going forward or not. And the stories and rumors kind of went both ways leading up to this conference. Some said it would be dropped to increase chances of passing. Others said that it would remain all-inclusive, and still others said that ENDA was pretty much dead and was not going anywhere. Regardless, everyone in the Creating Change Trans Hospitality Suite that night was very optimistic, and you could really feel the energy when Mara Keesley, who is currently director, or still director of the National Center for Transgender Equality, started to talk that evening. I don't remember much of what Mara said during a fairly long impromptu speech. I imagine she talked a little about ENDA's history, the struggles to include gender identity coverage, and the difficulties with getting those outside the trans community to listen to trans concerns. I remember her talking louder over the increasing noise and finally hollering to be heard as the noise in the room got louder. I do remember that when she got to the point of saying that she had good sources assuring her that ENDA was moving forward, and that this time it would be and would remain trans-inclusive, everyone was cheering in the room. I tried to listen, but I wasn't wholly there because another event was playing out in a back room. We had closed off to keep it somewhat quiet and private. An hour or so before, when the suite was almost empty, the hosts that were there began working to address a potential suicide. A friend had noticed one of the guests, a young trans woman of about 20, who I'll call Anne, had been off to one side by herself. She'd been pretty gregarious and outgoing on the previous evenings, so this seemed a little unusual, and the person who noticed her kind of got a little closer to her and overheard her say something like, "Tonight's the night." And more concerning, she had scratched her forearm or cut it or something and was bleeding. The friend let me and the other host know, and while the other host talked with Anne, I ran to find a counselor. Thanks to the excellent folks that were managing and working, creating change, and they lit up cell phones to find the closest counselor as soon as they could. We had somebody up there in less than 30 minutes, probably more like 20 minutes or so. As the room filled with people to hear Mara Kiesling speak, Anne and the counselor made their way to the back room we had closed off to give them some quiet. While I was listening to Mara talk about INTA and watching the crowd in the room react, I kept wondering what was going on in the room where Anne and the counselor were talking in the relative quiet. They were in there a long time. While I don't remember any specific words that Mara said, I still remember the words of the counselor when the door finally opened and he came out and said quietly, "We have a way forward. She's going to be okay. We have a plan and we have a way to move forward." I started taking steps to come out of work the next month. It was my way to honor those words and to move forward for myself. I worked at that time at the public library. It was Dallas Public Library, and was asked to edit a form for a youth poetry contest. One of my comments was, do we really need to know a student's gender for them to enter a poetry contest? That could discourage transgender and intersex children from entering, was my rationalization. Of course, entering the poetry contest was not the most significant impact I thought that question could have, but I felt like that could open a conversation. The response from a usually very verbose colleague was very brief this time and did not open a conversation. It read only, "I'll forward the appropriate comments." When I was asked to code the final version of the form for our website, my suggested grammatical changes had been made, but the gender marker question remained, and I knew the comment was not considered appropriate. Over the next year, I helped address 2 more suicide threats and looked for ways to work around that colleague to make those changes. I was lucky enough to find a strong advocate who had the gender marker removed and has since told me that there is now no gender marker on any contest form or any library activity registration, with one exception that we're still working on now from a third party. But that advocate, the last time I gave this talk, I didn't want to out her because I hadn't asked her. Now she's enthusiastically given me permission to out her tonight, so I'm very proud to be able to publicly thank my friend and former supervisor, who is the current director of public libraries for the city of Dallas, Mary Jo Gadice. So it may be confusing that I talk about gender markers on contest entries together with suicide, but I do that because they are linked. Because what may seem to many like connecting a trivial item to a serious topic, such as self-harm, indicates something that I feel is one of the most deeply felt aspects of trans experience. And that's why I started the organization I now work with, which is Trans Pride Initiative. I can't speak for all trans persons in our extremely diverse community, but I have found that in being honest with myself in terms of gender identity, I am placed in opposition to a pervasive social power that tells me, in fact, I'm being dishonest. As trans persons, we are often told that our most fundamental and hard-won truth about ourselves is actually a lie. This is conveyed through the words people use, through their actions to not deny our identity, and through so many structural elements, like little checkboxes on forms that are intended to be X'd in accord with the initial X provided on the birth certificate a few seconds after we are born. When I told this story before, I was able to say that those first 3 instances of working with suicide threats were the total of my work with suicide threats, but I've had to amend that for this talk. Working in this field, issues of self-harm and violence are common, but there are increasing numbers of trans organizations working to address this by empowering the trans community. When the organization I work with tries to expand health care to trans persons and gender non-conforming persons, when we advocate for a trans person who is seeking shelter, when we in the future have a community center and a shelter that focuses on meeting the needs of trans and gender non-conforming persons, and when we take part in the efforts that have no other trans participation or representation, whenever we can openly, as trans persons, show that we have more to offer than just a confrontation to cultural definitions of honesty, when we do these things, we help address the root of that stigma. We help reduce the need for the individual screams of self-harm, and we hope that we help convert the concept of birth certificate-related dishonesty to one of appreciation for the integrity it takes to find this kind of truth. As I said at the earlier event, I think Dallas Way invited me here too early, as I really haven't done much yet, and most of what I'm trying to do is not very successful yet. But I hope I can live up to this invitation in the future. I'm proud to feel a participant in a community, an LGBT, IQA, etc. community that is showing greater willingness to act together, out and proud, as seen by events like this, and as your story showed, that address these issues. And this encourages me to feel that, like the counselor said to the young woman at Creating Change, I and we as a community have a plan and we have a way to move forward. Thank you.